Good morning. Thank you for coming to our Peace Symposium this morning. I'm Vikki Price. I am the Peace Support Lead for TUV, and everybody who's presenting in this workshop this morning are peers. So welcome. I'm going to be speaking first about peace support and social change, and then Beth and Geordie are going to talk about safety, and then the other Beth is going to talk about coercion, so that's what we've got in store for you. I'm going to be reading, which isn't my usual style, and the reason that I'm reading is some of this stuff really touches me personally. And I want to be able to be vulnerable in the room with you today, and I hope that when I go to those places, you feel okay to come there with me. But I can't do that if I've got to think at the same time. I'm like, feel or think, can't do both together. So please, it's okay to go there. We are human, we're all together this morning. Don't worry about me if there's tears or snot or whatever happens, it's okay. So I'd like to take you on a journey of social change. And it's a journey that's very dear to my heart. And I want to be clear that I'm talking about social change and not systems change. I'm talking about us as people, as humans together in this complex world, from our children to our parents to our grandparents, friends, family. And peer support is important in this, both inside and outside of the system. But I'm not going to start with peer support. I'm going to start in, hopefully, there we go. I'm going to start in Africa. So we're probably all familiar with the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. And we probably have an idea of what it means or infers. To me, this proverb means that a child not only benefits from, but needs their relationships with their community to grow in a safe and enriching environment and truly thrive. So education's taken this phrase to promote community responsibility for developing the knowledge and social integration of children. That's one place where you'll see it. But what's interesting to me is that I've recently come across the phrase, it takes a village to heal a child, that was passing in 1996, in specific reference to war zone trauma in Africa. And I wonder why this should not be true of adults as well. So I take this wise old phrase and ask, what relevance does this have to our mental health system? And if we're talking about trauma-informed care, what relevance does this have to the development of our mental health system in the coming years? In July of this year, the NHS released its 5-year plan to implement its vision of a more community-integrated approach to mental health service delivery. It seems the NHS is trying to build villages, and I think that's a really admirable thing. I would question whether the plan is trying to build discrete and functional villages around what it already knows, since it names those villages by service type, like crisis care, children and young people services, services for severe mental illness, etc. But I live in an actual village, and in my village, these things don't have arbitrary boundaries. But maybe that's a moot criticism, since we can't just scrap the NHS and start again. So I find myself asking, as a service user, service provider and service developer, what might I offer the NHS in order to nurture these villages that might begin from functional foundations but might grow to complex communities? And I gave it some thought, as I'm apt to do, since I'm also by trade an analyst, which is a flaw. And I think the answer is the gift of multiple stories. Language is shaped by culture, and culture is shaped by stories. So it stands to reason in my mind that across the world, the reason we have so many different languages, over 6,000 according to Google, with so many different words and so many different meanings, is because we have so many different stories. And I can't prove that, it's just a thought. And the relevance of language is going to be explored by some of the other speakers this morning. What we will explore together now, I hope, will be the idea that we all have multiple stories, and that these stories aren't linear. They don't fall one after the other in chapters that tell us where we've been and what we did there. They run concurrently, they overlap and they contradict. They tell the truth and they interpret the truth, and often they imagine the possibilities of what the truth could be. They change and evolve. They are as alive and growing as we are and as our world is around us. So if you've got a pen and paper, I would really recommend writing down this woman's name. Her name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, And I first became aware of her through Mark Allen, shout out. He's our CDP support worker. Not only is she a great storyteller, but she also finally articulated for me something I had struggled with for a long time, that it's okay to have multiple truths. We use her TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, in our peer support training, and I strongly recommend it. She tells that narrative much better than I do, but I will tell you this, it does what it says on the tin, the danger of the single story. It warns us of the danger of a single story. So let's talk about a single story today. Let's talk about a single story of mental health. There have been single stories in our past, these paradigm shifts that were spoken about by Sandra this morning. So there was a single story of demonic possession or a lack of religious faith. There was a single story of moral character. And there are potential new single stories emerging in our future. Currently, we have an emerging single story of recovery. And recovery stories are very important, but we have to be careful not to write for people that when you stop going to hospital, that you get a job, that you stop needing services, that we stop suffering and we stop being human, that the story ends. And we run the risk of a single story about trauma, where all mental health experiences are explained away by an imposed story about what other people's thoughts are of our childhood experiences and our interpersonal relationships. These are both dangerous stories if they become the single narrative. But to illustrate a single story of mental health most clearly, I want to talk about the single story of mental health that we've all heard, the single story of mental illness. And it's a powerful story told by powerful people. It has the power to overwrite all of my stories. And for a while it did. And most disappointingly, it's a problem story. It's something wrong with us. It's a story without hope. It happens every time I go into services. It's titled by the referral letter, which introduces me as a diagnosis. It's created an assessment where the single account of my history and my experiences that I'm able to offer in that room is rewritten as symptoms of a disorder. It's perpetuated by the understanding that to solve my symptoms based on my problem story, what I need is a care plan, which, and I know this isn't best practice, but is my experience, which inevitably includes a medications review, a selection of treatments, and when to ring the crisis service phone number. In the mental health system, for any member of staff, it seems to become almost impossible to see any other version of me. Their job as clinicians seems to become to treat the illness. Their job in service development seems to become to remove the barriers to enable the treatment of the illness. And my job as a service user seems to be to comply with this version of a narrative, to access the help that might never allow me to have a wider understanding of myself. My experience, guys. We all have different ways of telling our stories. I'm a musician, and one of the ways I tell my stories is through song. Sometimes my creativity and need to tell my stories is overwhelming. I can write half a dozen songs in a day. That's a lot, by the way. And when writing lyrics, I can fill notebooks in a week. I always saw this as my gift. The mental health system's single story of me saw this as a symptom. It is evidence that I am governed at that time by my disorder. And it immediately loses its joy. And for a long time, when these flurries of creativity came to me and I would rather write than sleep, I turned to the mental health system because I thought I needed help. I stopped telling my multiple stories to comply with the system's single story. I medicated away my need to tell my multiple truths. I surrendered the opportunity to make sense to a more powerful single story. This symptom must stop, and I need to be treated for it. And the people in the system, with all good intentions, told me it was in my own best interest to see things this way. It took a long time and a lot of conversations in trusted relationships for me to break through that single recurring story. And I remember some of those conversations distinctly. I remember my partner at the time, I was diagnosed, telling me, you can call it mental illness all you want, but I see you. I call it uniqueness, and that's why I love you. My best friend reminds me often that we don't have a friendship which has probably saved both of our lives many times, for the purpose of perpetuating mental illness, but for all the wonderful things we bring to the world together. Another friend reminds me that we all have our unusual ways, and that's okay. And often by sharing her quirky ways, I realise that her ways are really unusual too, and she doesn't have the benefit of a diagnosis to confirm that society knows that. And this lady, my friend, Beth Wilson, regularly reminds me that all behaviour has meaning, and we cannot make sense of our world when we only think of ourselves through the lens of an illness. I have shared many of my stories with these people, and they have shared many of theirs with me. Together we've created many new stories and evolved our own stories through our experience of each other. And these are only a handful of the people in my village. I don't have time to play you my songs, to tell you my multiple stories, as much as Beth and Geordie would love to hear them. So I'll move on to another great storyteller who used his art to make sense of his world. John Keats is one of the great romantic poets in the history of English literature. He's held in high esteem. I studied him at school, it's one of the reasons he came to mind. He's held in high esteem with the likes of his friends, Wordsworth and Shelley. Historians have chronicled his life from his birth in 1795 to his tragic young death in 1821. They have told us one of his stories. So born to a relatively wealthy family, and after almost an idyllic early childhood, Keats experienced his first great loss at 7 years of age when his infant brother died. At 8 years old, his father died in a horse riding accident which happened on his way home from visiting Keats and his brother at school. The remainder of his youth is a story of abandonment and loss, losing both his mother and his grandmother as a teenager, and losing his fortune to a corrupt guardianship system. He spent years struggling with the responsibility of his younger siblings in financial ruin whilst training to be a surgeon. In 1816, he quit medicine to pursue life as a poet, and in 1817, at 22 years of age, his first poem was published. The following year, he contracted tuberculosis from his terminally ill brother while caring for him in the last stages of his life. The things that he'd learned in medical school caused him to contract tuberculosis from his brother. And his brother died soon after. And Keats probably wrote his last poem a year later in 1819 and left the UK for Rome under doctor's orders since he was told he wouldn't survive the British winter. Little did he know that the cross-Europe trip itself would do him more harm than good. 6 months after leaving England, in 1821, and at 25 years of age, Keats died in Rome, separated from the love of his life, Fanny Brawne, who was awaiting his return in London. And that's a really tragic history of one of our greatest poets. But his poems tell us many different stories. They tell of a man who loved deeply and who wrestled almost inconsolably over the years with the conflict of beauty in life and grief of death. He takes us on a journey of making sense of the world and his own mortality. So I brought with me some booklets. Now, we had a bit of a thing this morning with the printer. I haven't got enough. But please do, if you want one, take one. And if you don't get one, you can get one from us later. That's fine. So there's 3 of his poems in the booklet. They are Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, and To Autumn, and they were all written in 1819. Nightingale and Grecian Urn were written at the same time in spring of 1819. Those stories existed side by side. The first is the story of a nightingale singing too happily and too easily in a world plagued by pain and death. And the only explanation Keats offers for the existence of this beauty in the world is that it can't be tied to mortality. The nightingale's song must be immortal. And alongside that, he writes an observation of the paintings on an urn, including 2 lovers who, frozen in time, will always love and will always be beautiful, and whose moment will never fade and die, but whose future will never be realised and whose existence can never be true. They will never feel their love deepen and grow or know the pain of its loss. These are 2 reflections of a man trying to make sense, to understand his own mortality, fighting with the belief that all that is beautiful around him fades or dies, but that to freeze it in time or make it immortal means it can never be part of this world. To Autumn was his final word. Some believe that it might have been the last poem he ever wrote. And in it is an evolution and an acceptance of his understanding. He tells us that all seasons have beauty and that the beauty must be born and live to die and make way for the next season's beauty. And perhaps autumn, with its ripe fruit and harvest, is the most beautiful season of all. And although he doesn't say it in the poem, can we perhaps think now that he accepts the next season, winter, is the inevitable death that allows for the birth of spring and the cycle to start again? And I like to see it this way. I like to believe that to autumn is Keats telling us that he has made his peace with death and therefore has found way in his own autumn to enjoy the beauty of life. So I ask, what would become of Keats 200 years later if 1819 was 2019? Right now, or very soon, he'd be writing To Autumn. What would his 2019 To Autumn say? Would it be any different if he had told Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian urn in a mental health assessment in May? I worry that it would have been different because he told it to the system whose job it seems to be to rewrite our stories through the lens of disorder. That our system would do what it does for his own best interest. It would diagnose and treat our poet. He would probably be depressed. He might be drug dependent. He's probably got suicidal ideation. Perhaps he dissociates when he frees his time for the urn. Or perhaps his metaphor is a psychosis. Do we really know that there was a nightingale? To Autumn, written in September 2019, could easily be an illness story. His reconciliation might be that he has a brain disease. He might never have found the beauty that lives and dies to live again in his seasons. And albeit he may not die of tuberculosis in 2021, because medicine, he might live another 50 years, we might know if he ever made this kind of sense. And I very much imagine that none of us in this room would want that final illness story for Keats. We all so much more want, and as a community need, to hear us tell it about his autumn. So, what does Keats have to do with peer support? That's a good question. Peer support's about social change, and the way we negotiate our peer relationships facilitates and enables social change. Peer support relationships are community relationships. They are reciprocal and mutual, and they're built on foundations of connection and trust. They allow us to be vulnerable together, both of us. And they allow us to tell many of our stories, including those, if we choose to, that we keep the most hidden, both of us. We are curious about each other, and we weave together as we explore our different versions of the world and create new truths and possibilities. And let me be clear, this isn't a case of, I tell my recovery story to you, you tell your recovery story to me, I learn from you, you learn from me. These are conversations, it's organic storytelling, and it's learning together as we walk in this complex world with our complex selves. And maybe in time together and with the rest of our village, we write our To Autumn, or maybe we don't. But all of a sudden, in a world where the single illness story is pervasive, To Autumn becomes possible for both of us. Through peer support, there is a possibility that our system and our community can become a community with many stories and with many cultures and with many legacies. So I asked some of the peers that I know to respond to one, two, or all three of those poems written by Keats. I asked them to be his village. And their answers, their replies are in those booklets. And I'll ask you to take them with you and read them. Maybe be curious and be open to learning something about yourself. Maybe you might choose to respond to Keats and his village too. Maybe there's something that you can take with you into the world from his and their combined truths. And we invite you to be part of our village. It's likely that there is no African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. It was researched in 2016 and the origin of the phrase was never found in any African language. But there are many similar proverbs across Africa which might combine and evolve to form it. So I'll translate those for you. The first one, a child does not grow up in a single home. The second one, a child belongs not to one parent or home. And the third one, this isn't a direct translation, but regardless of a child's biological parents, its upbringing belongs to the community. And finally, whomsoever is not taught by the mother will be taught by the world. And there's many more. Those are just the easiest ones to find. And through these multiple ancient truths, we found a combined story about villages. In peer support, our intention is social change. And so the social change that we seek leads us from a place of an imposed story to a place where, among other things, our relationships enable our multiple stories to be heard, shared, and evolve in our community. So this workshop description asks, how do we ally with peer support to generate social change? And this is what I would suggest. And I'm only one voice. We can all open the conversation to possibility, and we can all acknowledge that there are multiple versions of the truth. We do it for each other all the time. We can all listen, not with judgment, but with curiosity, when stories conflict and seem impossibly at odds. And when we do, what happens is that we all cease to view people through the lens of a single story. Whether that story be a story about illness, or a story about trauma, or a story about spirituality, or any other kind of story of which there are infinite. We learn that all of these stories can coexist alongside many more, and we create spaces to share them, and we can seek them out and explore them. Maybe then we stop thinking we hold the answers, and we stop trying to fix the stories that seem broken. We draw on our relationships to build the communities that make To Autumn possible. We walk with people to their autumn. We walk with people as they find their village and they become part of it. And if we're really lucky, they will invite us to be part of their village too. Thank you.